Good morning. We've got a great kickoff panel here. We've got some really incredible panelists that I'm excited to introduce to you. And I just want to say the goal for this panel this morning is we're going to talk about a number of issues that Detroit is facing, issues that the panelists have identified, and what it's going to look like when those issues are solved. Not necessarily talk about or the one way to get to that solution, but we're going to talk about what Detroit looks like now and what it's going to look like when these particular issues are solved. They're going to go into how they're particularly handling and fighting those issues on their own, but what I want you to keep in mind is how can you help? Listen to the issue that's being mentioned and listen to the solution the way it looks and think about what you can do to help Detroit get to where it needs to be. So I'm going to start first here, right on my immediate left. This is Chad Rochkind. He's the founder of Human Scale Studio, and that's a consultancy that provides people-centric solutions to issues in cities, neighborhoods, and businesses. He was recently recognized by Metropolis magazine as one of the 10 new talents in America for his work in galvanizing the community in Detroit, specifically the young professional cohort. And he was nominated for that award by Vishaan Chakrabarti, who's one of the most talented and noted urban planners in the country. Immediately next to him is James Feagin. James heads up Feagin Media Group, and that's a consulting firm that offers program design, strategy, and communications for foundations and corporations. But really, to sum it up best, is James knows Detroit businesses. So when organizations like NEI, Motor City Match, DEGC, Wayne State University, and Knight Foundation want to get in touch with Detroit businesses, they get in touch with James. Next to James is Lauren Hood. She's an urban planning professional and co-founder of DeepDiveDetroit, an organization that, I like this quote, creates a safe space for uncomfortable conversations between disparate groups, and that's something that Detroit desperately needs right now. She's often tapped for her understanding and connection to Detroit and its people. For example, she served as the community engagement managers for Loveland Technologies during its huge Motor City mapping project, where they collected data on each and every parcel in the city of Detroit. And next to Lauren is Maggie DeSantis. Maggie's been involved, feels like too small of a word, but involved to say the least in community development in Detroit for nearly 40 years. She is the president and CEO of Eastside Community Network, which is formerly known and most recently known as the Warren Connor Development Coalition, which is one of Detroit's largest and leading community development organizations, and it's over on the east side of Detroit. So we've got a bang-up panel here for you this morning to talk about the issues that they're working to solve in Detroit today. So what I'm going to do is have each of the panelists spend about 2 to 3 minutes and talk about an issue that Detroit is facing and what it's going to look like when that issue is solved, what that Detroit looks like. So let's start with Chad.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Cool. So thank you for having me. It's great to be here this morning. The problem that I think is often underlooked in Detroit is that the roads are too damn wide. We often like to think about business development, real estate development, et cetera, but one of our greatest assets is our public space, and our streets are some of our largest public space in terms of sheer area. If you go out on the street, it's very clear that the environment is not made for you, it's made for automobiles. This city was built on automobiles, but one could also argue that the preference for the automobile over the pedestrian also led to its decline. You could trace the creation of the freeways to the decline in population. You can trace the creation of freeways to the destruction of neighborhoods, particularly African-American neighborhoods. In the neighborhood that I work in, Corptown, we've seen a modest growth in our commercial corridor. I think the narrative around Corptown has maybe gotten a little bit further ahead than where we are. And I think part of what's holding us back is the width of Michigan Avenue, which is technically a state highway. In the narrative of Detroit, people often say like downtown, midtown, Corptown, as if they're the same thing. Corptown is the one that is the outlier in that situation, in my opinion. Downtown has a commercial vacancy rate of about 10%. Midtown has a commercial vacancy rate of about 13%. And Corptown has a commercial vacancy rate of about 60%. So there's still a long way to go in terms of making Corptown the neighborhood that it can be. Michigan Avenue, if you're not familiar with it, is about a seven-lane state highway that is also Corptown's main street. It was not originally built that way. It was originally built to be half the width, and in the 1930s it was expanded to make a freeway. So it's a classic example of freeway expansion leading to a decline in the neighborhood. Even the business growth that we've seen, and it's great, is largely focused around restaurants and bars, and I love all of the restaurants and bars in Corptown. But because of the width of Michigan Avenue and the fact that most of our residential is on one side and most of the commercial is on the other, what happens is neighborhood amenities like pharmacies and laundromats and all the things that make urban life full and rich and great and make it so that you can walk anywhere, it makes it that much harder to create an environment that allows for those things to happen when you have a freeway running down the middle. So when the work is done, what does it look like? It looks like you walking from Slows down to Detroit Institute of Bagels and being able to go through any of your neighborhood amenities, run into somebody that you don't know, have an experience that you weren't expecting to have, rather than just getting in your car, knowing that you're going from point A to point B. You would have a little bit more serendipity in your life as a result.
Thank you.
Chad's really smart, and I probably should have went first. So I've been kind of wrestling with this topic since, do I call him Professor Tarver or Mr. Tarver? How do I call him? David, all right. David says I can call him David. So David and I have been talking for a while, and we had some really good conversations on the phone. And the blessing about my work is I get to kind of see this thing from a lot of different angles. I spent some time, at the table with foundation presidents and government officials and corporate folks who are, what should I do with this $100 million? And that's awesome. And then I get to spend the time in the barbershop on 7 Mile or in the small business or in the neighborhood business on the Eastside and, really understand like what's happening on the ground. And my work is to try to connect the two and really make sure that what we're doing from a policy, resource, program perspective actually moves the needle. So even backstage, I was like, okay, well, what one problem am I going to talk about? And I think a lot of it can really be summed up, and I don't mean to offend anybody, but the last slide with the 3 circles, so you talk about awareness, motivation, and capability. There's an issue of how are we defining capability? And then the second is the 3 of those alone don't get the job done, because I meet plenty of people every day that are aware of the problem because they live it, they face it. They're definitely motivated. And depending on how you find capability, they are more than capable of addressing the problem. The issue for them is the resources to actually address the problem. And the resources are often tied to, not even tied to things, they're just not necessarily readily available to solve the problem in a way that could be solved locally. Whether you're talking about economic development from a large-scale perspective with a CDC or a block club, or if you're even talking about just a neighborhood small business that understands what they need to do to compete, they want to do it, but there's a lot of different barriers that they face that the resource world isn't even necessarily aware of to actively address. And so that's really I'm not supposed to get in the solutions yet, am I? So I think that's the problem, is really understanding how to properly get resources to where they need to go to spur more homegrown solutions, in short.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? It sounds low. Thanks for making it to the first panel of the day. I usually miss like the first 3 of any conference I go to. I think of things more on a meta level, so when I think about what problems need to be solved, I'm like, okay, that's the problem, but there's a deeper level, a deeper level, a deeper level. And I feel like at the deepest level, our problem here is inequity, and it's racial inequity. I don't want to turn this into a social justice conference, but all the hats that I wear, all the jobs that I do, and the LLC I started, they're all somehow involved in doing community development, but all working to solve inequity. So the company I started, DeepDiveDetroit, kind of evolved from me and some friends of mine, mostly black, who are native Detroiters, but also interact in this kind of world. We're on panels, we're getting interviewed in newspapers, we're at the table with the people like Feagin said, the foundation people who are like, how do I spend this money? So we're in that civic sphere, we're hanging out with new Detroiters, we're kind of new Detroit, but we're also very old Detroit, and we would have these conversations like, how do we bridge that gap between the new people that have all these resources and the old people that have all this capacity and all this knowledge but don't have resources. So my organization facilitates dialogues between those disparate groups, trying to to build that bridge, because I think the biggest problem here is inequity, and all the other problems that we have to deal with, like the housing crisis, the water, like all those issues are just a lesion caused by the cancer of our racial inequity.
Lauren, thank you for, is this on? Thank you for describing me to a T. I'm one of the old people without the resources that she referenced. Forgive my tardiness. When I read the flyer, I didn't look at the address. I read College for Creative Studies. I went to the campus on John R. Sorry. Which is another indicator of how old I am, because that's generational. When you say CCS, I'm on John R. So as I understand it, we're each asked to describe a problem, describe what the solution looks like, and then
What it looks like when it's
when we're
solved.
done, and then we'll talk about how we get there. Okay. So picture the community defined by Mount Elliott on the west, I-94 on the north, the Detroit River on the south, Alta Road bordering Grosse Pointe on the east. From 2000 to 2010, 40% of the people who lived in that community left. And as you can well imagine, roughly the same number of businesses left, because retail, consumer-oriented businesses tend to need nearby customers to survive. The foundation community began to target their investment toward certain neighborhoods around the city that they viewed as having certain kinds of potential or met certain data requirements for the kinds of work they wanted to do. Perhaps there were large populations of young people, which we didn't have. Perhaps there was a stronger density, which we didn't have. So the problem we were faced with, starting in, we understood it was happening in the early 2000s. By the mid-2000s, we were asking what we should do about it. So fast forward 10 years later, and what we have is a community that has not gained net population. So we're still with the same population. Perhaps there are a few more businesses, but they are not necessarily retail-oriented, consumer-oriented businesses. There are a handful of neighborhoods that would have been defined as high-density neighborhoods. We would call them high resident activity neighborhoods, so as to avoid using the term density. And those few neighborhoods are more active compared to years before. The commercial corridors remain largely empty of buildings, but they are beautifully landscaped. The landscape tends to be colorful, low maintenance. The plantings tend to be cleaning the soil and infiltrating rainwater. And along some of the commercial corridors, there are some multi-unit buildings, much more dense, if you will, housing units built there. There is a lot more recreational green space, and local residents tend to be employed at businesses that tend to be more focused on landscape-based business activity. So just picture all that.
Got it. Thank you. So we have 4 completely different problems here. We have a city that focuses on cars instead of people. We have resources that are completely disconnected from the businesses that they're trying to serve, neighborhoods that have emptied out. And from a larger standpoint, it really, if you could wrap that up in a bow, it would just be reflective of the decades of systemic disconnection from the city. So you're each seeing different pieces of this problem, but that's overall like what has caused this. So Lauren, I'm really interested in hearing, to really address the underlying issues that are there, you do have to have those hard conversations, and they're not easy to have. You can talk about these things with friends and break down into fights. So how do you set the table for these disparate groups to talk about things that are very, very difficult to talk about, that might bring up sticky subjects like race and inequality? How do you set that stage to have a conversation?
Well, for me, it's really easy. I call it a difficult conversation for people that don't normally have those talks. So if you are a brown person of any shade, you probably have these kinds of conversations all the time. So it's really just difficult for white people, I think, which is fine. Can I say white people? I feel like this is a tense little room. Like white people, black people, there, it's out there. But the way to make the conversation go well is to really be comfortable, like putting your own hangups on the table. So I tell a lot of my personal stories, and I wasn't always thinking in an equitable way. I used to look at different people and make snap judgments, so I like to address that when I'm having those kind of conversations so that other people are like, oh, that's perfectly normal. Yes, yes it is. And we're kind of conditioned to be racist. If you've ever watched a television or read a piece of classic literature or listened to the radio, there's so many things that are like inundating you with these messages, like it's kind of just the American way to be thinking like that. It's really not all your fault. So when you address it in that way and like don't point the finger at people and blame people, just say, look, this is kind of just a result of being in America at this point in time. Then people can be comfortable with being like, oh, I have had those kinds of thoughts. And it's perfectly normal. Not healthy, but perfectly normal.
And what is the success rate in those conversations? Like, how often is it that people will be able to see a different way of thinking?
Well, that's a problem I have. Maybe somebody in here can figure out a social metric, like how can I judge the effectiveness of these conversations? So I'm on this panel as a result of one of those conversations. My buddy Ben over there was in a group of Venture for America fellows that I had a conversation with about community engagement and gentrification. And he's like, something you said in that conversation really struck a chord with me. I think you should be involved with this Urban Entrepreneurship panel. And then David was like, Ben talked to me, so be on this panel, come talk to my class. So I guess it was successful, because if nothing else, it at least reached Ben in a certain way. And now Ben is submitting a Night Cities proposal for this thing called the Other Side that will get people from like city, suburbs, black, white to come work together. And he said that was inspired by the conversation that we had with the fellows. So to me, that makes it look successful, but I don't know how many times that happens that I never hear about. Like that's just the one from the most recent dialogue that I did.
So Lauren's issue is racial inequality, and the way she's solving it is by putting it out there and having that conversation and jumping out first with the things that maybe we don't want to say, and it makes other people feel comfortable and maybe following up to that. So Chad, you talked about the roads being too wide and us being more car-centric than people-centric. What are you doing to solve that issue?
A few things, but I think that this issue is actually tied somewhat to the issue that Lauren's bringing up, which is our physical environment actually separates us from each other, so that you have to force these conversations to happen. In a walkable urban environment where there's multiple types of people, mixed income, people will encounter each other on the street. And I think part of what's happened in Detroit, and we are one of the most segregated regions in the country, is people just are able to live in their own little silo just because of how our environment is designed. So I think the issues are linked, and if we solve for one, we can help solve for the other. Specifically in my work on Michigan Avenue, I'm trying to take a two-pronged approach to how you approach large-scale infrastructure change in an urban environment. So the traditional route is like master planning, where you have like your diagrams, you have your renderings, you have your proposed vision for the future. In Detroit, there's been a lot of those and not a lot of action, even though it's a necessary part of the process in terms of galvanizing support, getting the large cohort of government agencies that touch every place in Detroit. But if it's just hanging out there and nothing's happening on the ground, then people feel that nothing's moving. So pairing long-term master planning with tactical urbanism, which is these sort of shock actions in the urban environment that gesture towards the future that you want. So for example, 2 months ago, we took away a parking space and put in a public space in front of Astro Coffee. It was a public space that was open to anybody. It was not an extension of any business. You started to see that, one, like what it would feel like if the road was 1 lane shorter, but then also if there was actually a space for people to meet each other randomly on the street. And so you can have that conversation around in a boardroom around a table, talking theoretically about what it would look like, but if you can do these short-term actions where rather than having that meeting in a boardroom, I'm having the meeting at this action, and we're sitting in the parklet talking about what we should do about Michigan Avenue. It's just a lot more powerful. We did that technically illegally, so it was kind of an act of civil disobedience, but that was part of its power. But we also were engaged in a process with Michigan Department of Transportation while we were doing that. So we were trying to, one, push the conversation beyond their comfort zone, but also engaging in the traditional dialogue at the same time. I don't know of any specific area that's had that two-pronged approach. If you are aware of places, let me know, because I want to talk to those people. But I think that there's something to kind of these shock actions and also the traditional process, and kind of not posing yourself as establishment, but also not posing yourself as kind of this radical rebel, and kind of a hybrid of the two. I hope that is a secret sauce that can help make change happen.
So it's also a matter of taking these ideas off a piece of paper and putting it in action so people can actually see it when they walk by.
Yeah, so that parklet costs $5,000 to do. A rendering would have cost actually probably around that amount, maybe more. And so this was a real life thing that people could experience. And now we have all the photographs of people using it. We have the actual people who had that experience who now are angry that it's no longer there. So now that's a political emotion that we can help mobilize towards change. And so I think there's multiple things like that. And I don't think like the solution that we had, which was to take away parking space and put in a parklet, is not necessarily the long-term solution, but it gets the conversation started, and it allows for a point of reference when we're going through these long-term planning. Actually, what I think is probably most necessary is just a simple sidewalk extension. It doesn't need to be anything fancy. Just give people more space, allow the businesses to serve on the street. So that also, one of the things that's happening in Corptown is there's been actually a few months ago, so it's not probably more common, you'll be safe, but there was a lot of car break-ins during the month of, I think, June. And part of the reason why that's happening is because there aren't eyes on the street. You go into all the businesses, they're packed with people. You go out onto Michigan Avenue, it looks like a ghost town, and that's because the environment is not encouraging of people being in it. And so then activities that are nefarious can happen without anybody looking at it. If you have people on the street eating, enjoying themselves, one, it would be more inviting for people to move up and down the street, but also criminal activity would decrease.
So Maggie, you and Chad are both working to make a specific neighborhood or an area of Detroit better and more accommodating to people. You've been in this game a long time. So can you talk about some of the projects that you have worked on in the past few years? I know the Lower East Side Action Plan was a federally awarded program for how effective it was. So can you talk about what you're doing to make the East Side of Detroit a better place?
Yes, absolutely. So let me try to boil this down to an elevator speech. So in recognition of the population loss, my organization and a couple of other community development organizations in that community decided to embark on a very, very different kind of planning process, using a planning tool that acknowledged that all that open space could be an opportunity, and that with the going in premise that we would not repopulate for at least a generation, and with the premise that if given enough information and enough data, and if there was a trust and a belief that residents could decide, that we could make a different kind of plan. So over a 2-year period, and in the end, seriously engaging somewhere around 7,000 residents, which out of a population of 53,000 is not a bad percentage at all. And using a planning tool developed through Community Development Advocates of Detroit, the Lower East Side Action Plan was created. And its basic premise is that you stabilize traditional neighborhoods by dealing in positive ways with the surrounding blight and the surrounding vacancy. So the plan was rolled out in 2012. We've been in an implementation stage since then. And the activities range from advocacy work, for example, in order to get a special green zone designation for that community to incentivize landscape-based investment. Residents can now access beautification grants, and then with help from Detroit Future City and Greening of Detroit, can beautify vacant land that they can either lease or buy from the Detroit Land Bank Authority through a special pilot project that we have with them, so they can begin to engage in reclaiming vacant land. With the help of the Knight Foundation, we're demonstrating low maintenance, low mow plantings that can be used on larger swaths, trying to show the city that a landscape strategy that is low maintenance and involves what we call maintenance agreements with nearby private sector businesses can result in beautiful landscape that just by virtue of its beauty can create a different psychology in the minds of people who live there and the minds of people who are considering investing there. So the irony of the work that's going on now, and it's counterintuitive, because as you know, the conventional wisdom around stabilizing neighborhoods is to target that neighborhood, to kind of place an invisible wall around it and throw all kinds of investments in that neighborhood, the theory being that that's going to cause more folks to want to live there and more to invest. Our theory is that if you take care of the surrounding blight and the surrounding vacancy without worrying about repopulation, that the folks living inside those more active neighborhoods will recognize that activity, feel better about the beauty, and the natural cycling of a real estate market will begin to happen, where people want to move in, sales and turnover are acceptable, and values remain steady or they begin to rise. So that's kind of how we're attacking it. I'll maintain till the day I die that we're right, but it's going to take a while for that to happen. It has frankly not been easy to convince. This is a mindset change, as you can imagine. I'm seeing some heads nodding, so I know you know what I'm talking about. It's a mindset change, and so leadership has to grab that mindset change. I appreciate Detroit Future City because that's the same premise for Detroit Future City. So the issue is we've got to get conventional thinkers, conventional investors, and city leadership to buy that mindset change in order to go forward. And hopefully we can demonstrate that in one community.
And I'm actually really curious to get your opinion on this, and James, you too, because I know you're out in the neighborhoods all the time. I mean, all of you are, but do you see that mindset changing over the past 10 years? We hear so often the fight between, or the perceived fight between city and neighborhoods. What is your take on that? Do you feel like the neighborhoods are being ignored? Is the situation getting better? What's your take on that, Maggie?
Well, no, some neighborhoods obviously aren't getting ignored. There are some neighborhoods that are getting a lot of investment. It's a natural phenomenon on some level. It's a little bit artificial when you look at investment being steered to certain neighborhoods versus other neighborhoods. But so in our process, we started to see the mindset change when we began to visualize how open space could look, how it could be productive. When people began to visualize and talk about wineries and tree farms and horse farms and hydroponic farming and just greenscape, natural greenscape, you could begin to see in very subtle ways that people were grasping it. We put out a typology called Urban Homestead that basically suggests that you can have a rural lifestyle right inside the city, go off the grid, have lots of land, and then jump in your car and go watch the Tigers play, all in the space of a day. So I think locally in our community we're seeing the mindset change. I'm hearing the mayor start to equate green infrastructure work with vacant land reclamation. And I credit the flood of August 2014 with helping us understand the real implications of bad stormwater management and how we can mitigate that. So I'm going to be an optimist, because you have to be to survive in this work. I'm going to say that there's a mindset change starting to creep in, but we're not there yet.
James, what's your take on that? We have, very popular neighborhoods, some not so popular that or not as well known. What is your take on that situation? Are we focusing more on neighborhoods lately, or obviously there's still more work to do, but have you seen a shift?
Well, I've experienced this a couple of different ways. My first foray into community development was actually working under Maggie at the Warren County Development Coalition. And at the time, we were either a targeted neighborhood or we were pre-targeting. So, we worked on commercial corridors and, we were deemed viable, and then some of those things happened. The funding from my position was actually lost as larger organizations decided to shift to certain neighborhoods. So, that kind of ended that portion of my career. And as I got back in economic development now, with the work that I'm doing with Any Ideas and Motor City Match and even the Night Cities Challenge and Night Arts Challenge, what I love is that when we walk into a room and we look at what we're going to support, we don't have a map up saying these are the hot neighborhoods. you have an idea-driven challenge that looks at the entire city as a place of opportunity that we want to see value in. So when you look at the winners' results from the Motor City Match or from any ideas, you may see some clustering, but you also see businesses that are outside of, the sexy hot neighborhoods with a real focus on the need to create local economic impact, even on a small scale. Could that still happen better on a larger scale? Definitely. But the work that I get to do, we look at, an isolated retail business that's held on as just important as filling that 10th vacant storefront in a dense commercial strip.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'd like to open it up if anyone has any questions. But from a big picture perspective, everyone here is involved in changing that conversation, or maybe it's even starting that conversation. Each of you has identified a problem, and you're working on your specific solution. You can't do everything. We have a lot of people in this room. We have a lot of students in this room that are thinking of going into this area. What are some other ways that your problem can be tackled for anyone out there listening that's looking for a project to pick up? So, Chad, besides you're going rogue and putting in parklets, what are some other strategies that you think would be effective in making people think differently about the way that we plan our cities?
Yeah, well, I think that particularly in Corktown, what we're interested in doing is making the neighborhood a place where you can experiment with some of these solutions. So I'm interested in, so if you have a solution for lighting, rather than prototyping it in a workshop, let's put it in Corktown, see if that works. I think we're focused on Michigan Avenue, but we're also thinking about the entire neighborhood and thinking about the neighborhood as a place where we want some of the best and brightest minds to solve for some of these infrastructure changes in partnership with the business community, in partnership with the residents, and in partnership with our government partners. So if you have a solution for an urban problem and you're looking for a place for it to land, talk to me.
I think I would finish where I started, which is to go back to that slide. As you're thinking about Detroit as an opportunity for you, and there's nothing wrong with that. You talk about awareness, motivation, and capability. You believe you have those things, and that's why you're looking to go in and invest or make change in a certain community. And right now we have this model of, well, I'm going to come in and I have this great social venture or business idea, and I'm going to create jobs for underserved communities or whatever that term of the moment is, which I can't stand any of them. And then there's this natural assumption that one of those things is missing. I know I keep pointing in my mind it's still there. So you assume that, well, if the problem's not already being solved in that community the way I think it should be solved, that there must be a lack of awareness, a lack of motivation, or a lack of capability. And that's one of the mindsets that I think we need to not just challenge, but just get off the way and kind of get to the next step. It's not just your employees potentially that are in that neighborhood, it's your partners. There are folks there who have the awareness, the motivation, and the capability. And if they just were paired with the right resources, it's not only just an uplifting opportunity for them, but it also can make your venture more successful, where instead of trying to reinvent the wheel from outside, you can leverage the knowledge and the relationships that exist on the ground and actually have a more successful, more impactful venture.
Yeah, what James said. I was totally, I had two things, but one of them was, I feel like a big problem here is the gap between people that are experiencing the problem and then people that have the resources to, I don't even like the word fix, assist in getting towards a solution for the problem. So there's a gap there. So if somebody could figure out an effective way for those two worlds to meet and bridge that gap. So I'm thinking, like, for this room in particular, we've got U of M people and Michigan State people, and you're like, I want to serve urban issues from Ann Arbor or East Lansing. You need to figure out, like, how to get down here, how to spend time here. And I guarantee you, any problem you come up with to solve, there's somebody directly associated with that problem, really close to that problem, who's been working on it a really long time. So figure out how to find out who those people are and connect them to all your fabulous resources and brain trust. The other thing I was going to say is, so I feel like urban entrepreneurs are different from regular entrepreneurs in that they want to get at some social issue. So there needs to be a means for measuring social impact. When I'm trying to explain like why these conversations are valuable or why any other kind of social venture is valuable, there's always like a gap in the conversation trying to prove that it made a difference. So if somebody can figure out a means of a social metric so that you can tell the story better to other people.
Oh my. Number one, move into the city with your friends to some neighborhood other than downtown, midtown, Corktown. I love Corktown, but you get my point. Other than downtown, midtown, Corktown, or Grandmont Rosedale. Move to Cadillac. Move to LeMay Street. Move to Seneca near Pingree Park and begin to experience the problem, because the experience of the problem creates a different way of thinking about what some of the solutions are. That's number one. Number two, a lot of what I appreciate about the generation that follows mine is the DIY mentality. I really do appreciate it, and it gives me hope on the one hand, but it also scares me a little bit, because it does tend to overlook the kind of collective action in the existing social networks that already are there in Detroit. So many of us who have stuck it out, I've raised a daughter alone for 21 years now in a neighborhood that that until recently was starting to empty out. You get this feeling of resentment when you feel as if people are moving in to help fix the problem. And you want to say, what about what we've been trying to do? So the challenge is to take that I can do this mentality, and I can do this myself, and that entrepreneurial spirit, and be willing to plug into the collective. And what that translates into is organize. So we need to organize to cause the Detroit Land Bank Authority to become a little more efficient and a little smarter about how it handles vacant land. We need to organize in order to point out some lessons learned to city government about things that could be done differently in how we manage commercial vacant land. We need to organize in order to reclaim some neighborhoods regardless of the population, but we need to do it from the perspective of living in the city. So I challenge you to find a neighborhood that you never heard of before, that looks pretty crappy, and move in, make an investment, and ask your friends to move in there too.
Well, I think that's all the time that we have. I thank the panel very much. Sorry we didn't have time to take questions, but I appreciate all the advice that you gave out there. So, yeah, I know. It went by fast, didn't it? Yeah. Thank you very much.
We think it's just the start of a major global shift, of a revolution, and I think that, the reason why we're particularly excited about Detroit is that, again,